Well, I'm here to talk about the Cold War in North America and the ways in which the Cold War affected both the U.S. and Canada in the both in the 1950s as the Cold War heats up and into the 1960s and beyond. The things that I think are most important to stress are that at the end of World War II, at the end of this great battle between sort of fascism and capitalism, although fascism and capitalism are intimately connected. Let's call it fascism and liberal capitalism, which is what's happening in Western Europe and North America. You see the rise of a new major power, and that major power is Soviet Russia. Soviet Russia, which fought alongside the Allies in the war against Nazi Germany, emerges by the end of the war as the other major superpower. So as Germany's power wanes, here comes Soviet Russia. And as I think we all know, that foments a period of real anxiety and real danger, palpable feeling of danger in the Western world, just as it does in the Soviet world, that these two countries, allied as they are with so many other like-minded nations, or nations that are imperially connected, are facing off. And this face-off really is the Cold War. And a lot of people talk about this sort of first world, second world, third world thing. This is something that many of us have probably encountered in our lives. A lot of that is Cold War ideology. It's the idea of being that the first world is the liberal capitalist West. So the United States, Canada are first world countries. Great Britain is a first world country. The second world countries are countries under the Soviet control, like the Warsaw Pact countries. So you've got Russia, but you've also got all of the countries behind the so-called Iron Curtain, which are the second world. And the third world are all the non-aligned countries, all the smaller countries around the world. And these are countries which, generally speaking, are poorer, are developing, are in need of help, and usually economic help, other sort of material aid from more developed countries in the first or second world. And so one way to understand the Cold War globally is actually the battle over these third world countries. It's the first and second world of the Soviet world and the Western world facing off over control of the third world countries, and therefore their people, and therefore their resources. So one of the things that characterizes the Cold War is that, and really what makes it cold, is that the Soviet Union and eventually Communist China never actually go to war with the United States or Canada or Great Britain. They never actually come to blows against one another, except that they do. They just do it in proxy wars. They do it in these third world countries. So Vietnam, for example, is this classic example of a proxy war where the Chinese and Soviets are giving material aid to the North Vietnamese, the communists, and the rebels in the south in Vietnam, while the Americans are getting material aid to a certain extent from Canada, from Australia, from other countries that have an interest in the U.S. winning this war. This is a war in Vietnam. It's really a civil war in Vietnam that is taken up by the two sides of this Cold War, and they use it. It's called a proxy war. They battle each other there. And what's great about a proxy war is it's ideologically driven. Great, that is for them. Is that it's ideologically driven, so it gives you a sense that, if the United States had won Vietnam, which they didn't, but if they had, it would have been capitalism overcoming socialism. It would have been a great victory in terms of the Cold War balance of power. The bad thing, of course, is that it is hugely destructive. It's amazingly unfair, and it leads to horrific destabilization of nations around the world. And there are a variety of these kind of proxy wars that take place, although Vietnam is certainly the most significant that the U.S. is involved in. So all of this is to say that there's a kind of wide global context of this face-off that characterizes the Cold War in the macro sense. But what does it mean in the micro sense, i.e. what does it mean for Canadians, for Americans? How does it affect their daily lives? And those are the questions that I'm most interested in approaching in my work as a cultural historian. Because I can't help but wonder, I mean, what would it be like to actually live under the shadow of the bomb? You know, this idea that the United States has detonated a nuclear weapon to end the Second World War, proving they have it. They developed an even more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. They now are building these into, they're weaponizing them in missiles, working to generate technologies which, you know, that are rocket powered, so you can actually send a missile over great distances. And they're developing these through the 1950s. And then the Soviets detonate a bomb. And then eventually the Chinese. Now we have nuclear powers facing off. We have two powers that effectively, if they decide to go to war together, if this Cold War turns hot, there could be the end of the world. And it might just happen. I mean, these people hate each other, supposedly. These are ideologically diametrically opposed. These are two ways of life that are seen to be incompatible in the extreme. And Soviet countries are run, many of them, by quite totalitarian, autocratic leaders who are extremely vicious towards, and greedy about power, but vicious towards any challenges to their authority. It is seen that there's a great possibility that people like Khrushchev in Russia by the mid-50s, that he might indeed be willing to engage in nuclear war, to actually be part of destroying the world. And Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States, also is a saber-rattler in some ways, but leading into John F. Kennedy's regime in the early 1960s, which in many ways he's remembered as a peaceful guy, as a beacon of peace, but he was a Cold Warrior, absolutely. And the closest that the world ever came to actual nuclear war that we're aware of is in 1962 over Cuba and over the Soviet aid to Cuba, giving Fidel Castro and his band of revolutionaries, many of them influenced by Marxist ideas, gave them nuclear weapons. And so now they're nuclear weapons 50 miles off the coast of Florida. And many of you probably know this story, but there was a face-off between the two of them, the two nations, that is the Soviets and the United States, over the period of about 13 days in October of 1962, during which time people, my parents, actively planned for what would happen if they actually started shooting nuclear weapons at one another. What would that mean? So, I think it's hard for us to imagine. I mean, we've experienced, many of us lived through and saw, all of us, I would assume, the September 11th events, which heralded a new day, right? I mean, that was the kind of thing you see, it's terrifying, it's profoundly upsetting, and it causes you to become more anxious, among other things. But, you know, socially, we've experienced over the past 10 years a great deal of anxiety, looking for terrorists, trying to become more aware of the idea that there are people around us that want to hurt us, that think differently from us. All of these sort of messages are in the air. Well, this is the Cold War. That's what it was like for them in the 1950s. There was a genuine sense that this could happen again, that another world war like the Second World War could break out, where major nations decide to battle it out and there's huge carnage, except for in this case, they'll probably just wipe out the world with nuclear weapons. So what does it mean to grow up in that, and what are the ramifications of that? There's a variety of things that we can talk about, but I think the principal issues that come up are those around security. The idea of how do you make a nation secure against a threat that comes out of nowhere, that comes from the sky? I mean, a nuclear attack, if you can't predict that rocket is coming, it's going to land on your head before you know that it's coming. I mean, this is the thing about nuclear warfare, is that you've got to develop vast matrices or matrices, I'm not sure what the plural is of that, of distant early warning type apparatus, so that you can ensure that when those missiles are launched, you have enough time to react. The question, of course, arises, how does one react? even if you know that it's coming, even if you know that you've got, you know, an hour until the missiles touch down in downtown New York or wherever it is, what do you do? I mean, where do you go? How do you protect yourself? Is the war already over once they fire those missiles? Well, of course, you can press the button and fire back, knowing that though you'll all be wiped out, so will they, so nobody gets to win. But is that really winning? In the 1950s in North America, throughout North America, people are building fallout shelters in their backyards. They are literally hiring companies to do it. You can look in the back of magazines like Life magazine, etc., from the period, and there are companies that are selling fallout shelters to build in your backyard. You can look at housing listings in Canada in that period. If you're in a major city that is a potential target for a nuclear strike, you can look at housing real estate listings that actually list fallout shelters in the backyard as like as a bonus. You know, you don't have to build your own shelter; they've already built. You know, that kind of thing. I mean, the idea is that it's normalizing instant death. You know, or at least some kind of horrific aftermath to a nuclear holocaust. And it's that normalization of the threat of death, the threat of destruction, that really opens up the floodgates of anxiety in the 1950s. Even people aren't necessarily political about this. They don't necessarily hate Soviet Russia for any particular reason. They might not know anything really about communism per se, or about the particular approaches to communism undertaken in Soviet Russia, but they fear the death, and that fear is palpable and meaningful. And one of the things that that happens to, let's say, amplify the anxiety in North America is that in the late 40s, it's actually uncovered. This is one of the rare moments when Canada matters on a really international scale. But in 1945, I don't mean to sound too flippant about that, but I'm a Canadian historian after all. But in 1945, Igor Guzenko, who's a Russian cipher clerk working in Ottawa, defects. That is to say, he effectively crosses over from the Soviets into Canada, and he says, you know, I want your protection. I want to become a Canadian citizen. And Guzenko, in doing that, says, listen, we've got problems. There is a ring of spies operating in Canada, and in the United States, of course, as well. And I can help to expose them. I can help to explain what's going on. And this idea that there were secret, clandestine spy rings that were operating in Canada really obviously amplify the anxiety, as I say, but also suggest that more needs to be done in terms of security. How do we protect ourselves? And so something that happens in the 1950s, which is quite entertaining in retrospect, but I suppose entertaining at the time really, was that was pop culture began to reflect this sense of anxiety and this sense of fear that was everywhere. And again, this impending death idea. But the thing they were most interested in was this idea that the person beside you might be a spy. And how could you know? And some of this has to do with sort of generalized fears of the other, so fears of immigrants, fears of mixed neighborhoods, a lot of stuff that's happening in urban centers, in particular after the war, as lots of Europeans are emigrating from war-torn Europe into Canada and the United States. But a lot of this really has to do with this, the invisibility of ideology. I mean, you know, I could be a communist. Can you tell by looking at me? You know, there's no way to tell. And information, you know, it's in the ether. It moves around without, it can't be monitored. But yet, security services attempt to monitor it. And so in Canada, thousands upon thousands of files are opened up on individuals that are suspected of being communists. Whether or not they're actual agents of the Soviets, or whether they're what they call fellow travelers or aiders and abettors of communism, didn't necessarily matter. They were to be followed. And so again, files are opened up on these people. In the United States, they go further, at least publicly they go further. The House Un-American Activities Commission is put together, a committee, which actively seeks out communists in public life, and they looks for them, tries to find them, puts them up on show trials. They go up against, you know, this committee, and they have to sit there and answer, you know, famous questions like, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And in many cases the answer was yes, because it didn't used to be illegal, 20 years before, when people flirted with the idea that maybe this was an alternative way of running things. Well, now you're a pariah. People are losing their jobs. People are having their reputations destroyed. So people are hiding it actively, which makes them look even more like spies and like they are guilty of something. In Hollywood, this plays out. There's a blacklist in Hollywood. Any of the artists, filmmakers, film writers who had been engaged at all in left-wing activity or communism in their earlier life were actively sought out and fired. But not just fired, blacklisted. They could never work in this town again, that type of thing. And there's some very famous cases of this. There are also famous cases of actors, artists who told on their colleagues, who called them out. Probably most famous of them was Ronald Reagan, who would go on to have a fairly powerful influence over United States politics and anti-communism in general. This plays out in the movies, though. This plays out in music. This plays out in pop culture. People are living with this sense of anxiety and concern over their neighbor everywhere. And some of the big movies of the 1950s, some of the really interesting subgenres that grow up around science fiction. And a lot of science fiction movies in the 1950s rely on the same trope of everyone in your little town is infected with some kind of strange virus or alien presence that has caused them to become evil, but you can't tell by looking at them. Right? The most famous example is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but there's several other iterations of this theme, and it all revolves around this idea that there's an invisible, dangerous, nightmarish infection floating around, and you could catch it. Everyone around you, who do you trust? How do you trust anyone? This is the rise of the suburbs. This is the rise of the time when the sort of pluralist urban center is transformed to a certain extent as many middle class, largely white, but generally middle class Canadians and Americans are moving out of the downtown cores into suburbs that are by and large new housing. The houses look very much the same. The lot sizes are very similar. The expectations are fairly strict in terms of heteronormativity. This is like heterosexual couples getting married, having a couple of kids, living in a certain way. And then these are the phrases that we associate with this, like the keeping up with the Joneses type idea. That if your neighbor gets the new Cadillac, you got to get a new Cadillac, or else you look like you're not doing your share to remain normal, that type of thing. And there's all sorts of ways you can think about that, but one of the most interesting ones is that it actually actively promoted in real life the setting for the Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This scene where you look around your neighborhood and everything looks the same. All the houses are the same. All the cars are the same. You've got 2.3 children in every single house. You got the same white Christian man and woman living together in the same houses. I mean, by bizarre paradox, accident, certainly it's a great trick of irony. While the United States and Canada are at their most rabidly anti-communist, i.e. anti an ideology which posits that everyone should be equal and that all goods should be equal and that individualism should be supplanted by community focus. It becomes a society that is largely based around everyone trying to be exactly the same as everybody else and to be normal and to keep up with the Joneses. And so of course Invasion of the Body Snatchers becomes the perfect metaphor for this. Not only is it about the idea that communism is sneaking around and could infect you and your neighbors, but it's also about the idea that it might not even matter if it's communism. It might just be conformity. It might just be that individualism gets killed by itself. An America so afraid of the other, so afraid of anything challenging its rule or its hegemony, its way of life, that it actually commits suicide. It commits suicide, its way of life, and pushes people into these cookie-cutter suburbs where they're living cookie-cutter lives. And so, strangely enough, the Cold War context it provides us with a real jumping off point for the major revolutions of the 1960s and the 1970s and beyond, as the children of these cookie-cutter suburbs, growing up in this environment of anxiety and fear and confusion and impending death, rebel against, many of them, these very structures. You know, the so-called hippie phenomenon, but also the rise of militant separatist minority rights groups, the so-called sexual revolution, gay and lesbian liberation. All of these different types of emerging responses are responses to this enforced normal that many people felt crushed them as young people. It caused them to feel part of a community, but a community that had no spirit.